Just in time, yes, you have just barely made it. Let me shrink this and get it out of the way. Okay, so we're going to start off today by talking about what an American is. Because it wasn't after the Revolutionary War that people in Europe started referring to the colonists as Americans. So let's talk for a minute about what exactly is an American. If it didn't have to wait until after the Revolutionary War, if you were a person in Europe and you were especially a person in England, and you were referring to the Americans, who is it you were actually talking about? Anybody want to hazard an opinion on this?
People born in the colonies.
People born in the colonies, okay. I think that you find that when you look back at the literature that they were referring to people who moved there as Americans too. And then they had opinions about what Americans were like. You can read about what the frontier does to people that makes them different from us Europeans and things like that.
Are these revolutionaries?
Yeah, they were sort of rebellious. There was a rebellious atmosphere about them. Okay, to get a better understanding of what an American actually was, I want to take us through a study of the man that is most commonly referred to as the first American. Does anybody know who it was? You should be able to guess from the context clues, but it's okay if you can't. Anybody know who we call the first American?
John Locke.
Nope. Nope. Close though. No, have to go back just a little bit more. All right, so let's talk about the man that we refer to as the first American. Okay, so in 1720, a 17-year-old refugee apprentice printer arrived in Philadelphia with nothing but a loaf of bread under each arm. In 1790, when he died at 87 years old, he was one of the most famous Americans to have ever lived. So when he was 17, he had absolutely nothing. He arrived in Philadelphia with nothing. And by the time he was 87 years old and dying, he was arguably the most powerful and one of the richest and most famous Americans to have ever lived. He was born in a strong Puritan family, but he ended up being a deist. He was born in the New England colonies, but ended up spending most of his life in the Chesapeake. He was born the penniless youngest son of a fabric dyer and became one of the richest, most influential men in America. So part of the reason why we refer to him as the first American is because he's the first one to really live that complete change of everything. He was the first one to actually go all the way through everything that the colonies had to offer and make the most of it. So he is like the epitome of what we think of as the American dream. You start off penniless and you end up with everything. So that's one of the reasons that we call him that. So let's talk a little bit about his life. Okay, Ben Franklin was born in Boston in 1706. Now Boston is the big part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony that really thrived. There are a couple, there's Boston and then there's a couple of other places in Massachusetts that really take off, but Boston is really where all of the wealth and the focus of that Massachusetts Bay Colony ended up. It had grown a lot. It went from about 4,000 people to about 13,000 people between 1685 and 1710. So it had grown a lot. Boston had become a place where major industry was taking place. It was a thriving port. All of the goods that were coming through all of the Massachusetts Bay colonies had to go through Boston to be shipped over to England and back. So it was a thriving port city. And it was the home of one of the first coffee houses. And when I say coffee house, I'm actually referring to what you think of when I say coffee house. A place for people to sit around and read literature and have discussions and drink coffee. So that was the home of one of the first coffee houses. It was still hugely congregational, even though the Puritan license had been revoked after the Glorious Revolution in England. Even though there was no more like you have to be a Puritan to live here, the congregational Puritan churches were still the ones that were thriving. They were the ones that were still the most powerful. You belong to the big church, you get to be in government, you get to make decisions. So there's still a really huge church presence. And Ben Franklin's father was what's called the tithing man, which meant that he was a leader in the community. And yes. Oh, you want me to clarify that? Okay, his father was married twice, and the first family he left in England. And then he came and remarried after his wife's death in England. He came to America and remarried and had 8 more children. So he actually, Ben Franklin is arguably one of 17 children, but his father had 8, and he was the youngest. So he was the youngest of his father's second batch of children, which was 8 kids total. So the other 9 got left back in England. And his father, like I said, he was a good, valuable member of the community because he was a church member. He was a pillar of the community, but he was pretty poor because he was a fabric dyer. That was all he did, was dye fabric. And that wasn't a very lucrative thing because you have to buy the fabric and you have to buy the dyes, and what you end up with is not that much more valuable than what you started with. So he doesn't make a lot of money at this, but he manages to mostly support his family as long as they don't want too much from him. It was really easy to be poor in New England because business moved as much as it did. It was really easy to find yourself as one of the lower class people in New England. And that was kind of what had happened to his father. Still, he wanted his son to attend a good school. One of the things about this big congregational community of Boston was that they still really valued education. Now, do y'all remember talking a little bit about the way that education was done in the Chesapeake colonies? Like, who's responsible for educating kids in the southern colonies? The families are, right. But in the New England colonies, it was important that they be educated outside their homes so that they could be prepared for the study of the scripture, which should be a lifelong pursuit of everybody that's anybody inside the colony. So establishing schools was a big part of those New England colonies. And Josiah really wanted his children to all go to school. So he sent his son to Boston Latin School for 2 years. Boston Latin School was the first, elementary school, if you want to think of it that way. It was the first grammar school built in Boston, and it was sort of a charity school. It was easy to afford to go there. So he managed to go to this, basically what was a public school, and he managed to get quite a bit of education. But the way that it worked is you went to the grammar school, and then when you got to be about middle school age, you went for that higher education. And if you couldn't go for that higher education, then you ended up doing a trade instead. His father could only afford to send him to the Latin school for 2 years. So he managed to go get his basic education at home and then attend 2 years at the Latin school. And then he had to quit going because his father couldn't afford it anymore, even though it was one of the cheaper schools that was available. But Ben was an incredibly smart kid. And so obviously they wanted him to have something. So they immediately apprenticed him to his brother James when he was 12 years old. When he was 12, he was apprenticed to brother James, who was a printer. Now, the thing about apprenticeship, especially in the colonies, but this is actually true in Europe at this time too, is that the way an apprenticeship works, if you are given an apprenticeship, your life is no longer yours. I mean, you belong to the person who's teaching you. You get no pay, none whatsoever. You work long hours, and in exchange for that, they give you room and board, and they give you all of the secrets of the industry that you've apprenticed into. And because you are privy to those secrets, because you are learning the secrets of the trade, you are not allowed to leave without asking your master's permission. You are not allowed to go anywhere. You're not allowed to go out. You're not allowed to travel. You're definitely not allowed to look for another job because you're taking his secrets with you everywhere you go. And that's too valuable a thing to just have wandering around in the brain of a 12-year-old. So apprentices are kept pretty much locked down, kept in home, kept on a tight leash, and then taught all of these skills. And Ben Franklin, he learned them pretty well. His brother was a good printer. He was pretty good at what he did, but you can imagine that chafed a little bit to somebody who had really wanted to go into higher education. His parents had wanted to send him to college, had wanted to send Ben to college in the hopes that he would become a minister. And in order for him to be a minister, he was going to have to go to one of those higher education places like Harvard, which was, which was in full swing. Harvard and Princeton were both booming universities already in the early 1700s. And they wanted him to go there and they couldn't afford it. So instead, they locked him in to his brother's keeping, and made him basically his brother's working prisoner. So that relationship did not go very well. Now, his brother was a good printer. He had published the very first independent newspaper in the colonies, which was the New England Courant. And it was a newspaper printed by colonists, for colonists, about colonists, which was, they could get newspapers that were from England. They were newspapers that were delivered to them that had news about them in them, but the news was written for Englanders by English people. So the news that was really local and effective and actually, things that affected them, there weren't a lot of those. But James Franklin did start the first one of those. And Ben Franklin really wanted to write for the newspaper. He wanted to write for it so badly that he begged his brother for 3 years to let him write articles for his paper. Let me do this. And he said no. He refused whatsoever to have Ben write for his paper. He was supposed to be learning to be a printer, not learning to be a writer. So Ben Franklin began to publish letters under a pseudonym. He began to write letters to the newspaper under the name of Silence Dogood. And Silence Dogood had opinions about everything. Opinions about life in the colonies, opinions about the muckety-mucks, opinions about crops and how shipping industry was going. Silence Dogood was really smart and very funny to the colonists. And James Franklin loved when this mysterious person would write a letter so that he could publish it. So he published them all, not knowing that it was Ben that was writing them. And this lasted until Ben was about 17 years old. At 17 years old, Ben ran for his life, basically. He took the little bit that he had, which was basically a couple of loaves of bread and the clothes on his back, and he fled to the nearest city that he could imagine making a life for himself in, which was Philadelphia. Now, Philadelphia is in Pennsylvania. If you remember your internal map, Pennsylvania is right on the edge of the Chesapeake. So it's close enough that it borders to New England, but it's right on the edge of the Chesapeake colony. So it's affected by their civilization, by their rules. It's mostly settled. Pennsylvania was originally settled by somebody who came from Massachusetts and didn't like it. So they have stepped aside from a lot of the ideals of John Winthrop and the city on the hill and all that kind of stuff. William Penn was trying to get away from that when he established Pennsylvania, and Philadelphia is there in Pennsylvania. So let's talk a little bit about Philadelphia. So Philadelphia at this time, at the time that Franklin gets there, is like a big potpourri of people. It's not, I wouldn't call it a melting pot because they don't really mix very well together. It's more like a buffet table of people. A lot of them are German immigrants. When they arrive, they call themselves the Deutsch, and that gets mispronounced to the Dutch. And so people think that they're from the Netherlands, but they're not. They're from Germany. So the Pennsylvania Dutch are actually transplanted Germans. And there are a lot of them living in Philadelphia. They're fleeing from all kinds of situations back in Germany, but they're also just fleeing from the poverty and the famine that's happening in Europe. And they're forming these massive societies. They move out into the rural areas and then they come back into Philadelphia to trade and socialize. The four biggest cities in the Pennsylvania area are Philadelphia. The four biggest cities in the colonies at all, are Philadelphia, New York, Boston, and Charleston. And so Philadelphia is one of the four biggest colonies that there is. And they have been receiving people in a way that the other colonies haven't. It's safe to move to Philadelphia. It's the most advertised colony to move to. They actually send people from Philadelphia into Europe to advertise, come and move from your troubled area into our not troubled area. Come and settle here. And so throughout Europe, people have heard of Philadelphia, even if they haven't heard of Boston or New York. Even if they have only the vaguest ideas about Charleston, they've heard of Philadelphia. So the dream for troubled people in Europe is, one of these days, I'm going to gather enough money to move to Philadelphia. So that's actually what has happened. And as a result, Philadelphia ends up with Jewish people, with Irish people, with Scottish Highlanders, with people from Southern Europe who are fleeing from discrimination, Protestants who are leaving France because France is like uber Catholic and is basically tormenting the Protestants. And so the Huguenots, which are the Protestants from France, are fleeing into Philadelphia because that's what they've heard of. Yes. Yeah, what happened in France isn't quite as bad as what happened under Bloody Mary in England, but it's close enough. They're basically being stripped of all their land, of all their property, and being pushed into a certain region of France. And from that region, there's no way to prosper. So their children are dying of starvation and things like that. So it's not so much they're being hung and tortured like they were in some countries, the Protestants, but they are definitely on the receiving end of a lot of discrimination that makes it impossible for them to live. Now, that's going to change in France. The crown head of France is going to make a deal with the Huguenots, but not yet. That's actually something Napoleon does, so we'll cover that later. But in the meantime, they're fleeing to the colonies, and the colony that they're fleeing to is Philadelphia, which is where Ben Franklin flees to also. So, okay, the reason that the Scottish were moving into Philadelphia is because of enclosure. Y'all remember about enclosure? What's happening with enclosure?
They're running out.
Right, because what's happening with the land?
They're putting so much sheep on it.
Right, because of the wool industry is booming in England, so they're turning land over to the sheep, and as a result, the Scottish, who live on the Highlands, are losing all of their land. So who's arriving in Philadelphia are not just Scottish people or Scots-Irish people, Scottish people who were forced to move to Ireland because of enclosure, but angry Scottish people and angry Irish people and unhappy French Protestants and displaced Jewish, Irish, Scottish, Highlanders, Southern Europeans. They're all moving in search of a better life, but it's not like oh, I know what I could do. I could grasp an opportunity. It's like I'm running for my life here. So they all arrive in Philadelphia and they try really hard to make the best of their situation, but there's also a lot of old world bitterness. When Ben Franklin arrives in Philadelphia, he's 17 years old. He manages to find work pretty much right away because it is such a mixed up population. He manages to find a printer who doesn't have anybody to do the work. He's already picked up most of the skills that James Franklin had to teach him. And whatever he doesn't know, he can learn really quickly. So he finds work working in lots of different printing shops, doing odd jobs in printing shops. He finds a home in a boarding house run by the Reed family. Remember, he's 17 years old. They have a 15-year-old daughter who he falls head over heels in love with and proposes to at 17. And her mother says, no, you may not marry my 15-year-old. Anyway, he meets the governor of Pennsylvania, who is passing through Philadelphia. And the governor likes him a lot. He thinks he's got a lot of moxie. He's got a lot of attitude. And convinces him to go to England and get better equipment for the printing shops. He convinces him we could update all of our equipment. We're going to send you over there. You know what you're looking for. Just get over there and get the equipment and come back. While he's gone, Deborah Reed's parents marry her off to a man who basically steals her whole dowry and then runs away to Barbados with it and leaves her married but separated and penniless. So that worked out well. When he comes back, he has been all over Europe, or all over England. He's been all over London specifically, but he's been all over England rounding up equipment. And over there, he met all kinds of interesting people. So he returns from his trip to England with all kinds of plans. One of the things that he absolutely believes is that it is through printing that the colonies are really going to start advancing. He believes that a lot can be accomplished through printing, that if you can connect people through printed word, then you can start really getting a colony to grow together and then to grow as a network. So he begins to start several different printing endeavors. One of them is the Leather Apron Club, or the Junto, which is the Spanish word for assembly. He forms this club and he bases it on a couple of things he saw when he was in London. There was something called the Dry Club in London, which was a place where people didn't drink. And then there was also a sort of a society back where he came from in Boston that he remembered from his youth. That was a society that was run by Cotton Mather. So it was like a moralistic society. And it was basically a group of people that came together and read books and then debated whether or not they were moral and what morals they taught, and had these conversations about right and wrong and all these deep philosophical conversations. And so they were called the Leather Apron Club, and he started them, and he ran it out of one of his printing shops that he worked for, that he began to gain, as the person with the governor he was able to rise in the printing business and begin to take over some of the printing shops that he worked in. So he started the Leather Apron Club. And these people would get together and they would talk about morals and right and wrong. And they would talk about them from the perspective of people who had been in a Puritan, background like he was. They'd also talk about it in all kinds of other philosophy. Plato and Socrates and Aristotle had morals too. Let's talk about those. Because there was so much reading associated with the Leather Apron Club, he knew that he had to get more books into the colony. So he and all the other members of the Leather Apron Club pooled their books together and put together as big of a library as they could, and then actually loaned the books out through a system called a lending library, which is all libraries to us, or lending libraries. But it was a new idea to them, the idea that you could sign out a book and borrow it and then bring it back after you had read it. There still weren't enough books, so they began to pool all of their money together so they could buy more books from England and fill up this lending library. And it really gained a lot of popularity. Books were very scarce, and people weren't rich enough to just buy books. Books were expensive. So the ability to actually read books without owning them was like a huge thing that he brought to Philadelphia. People began to donate the books that they had brought with them while they were fleeing into this library specifically so other people could read them, so they could have somebody to talk about with these books. From within his printing press, he established, in 1728, he established his own printing shop, and one of the things that he printed was the Pennsylvania Gazette. That was the first newspaper of Philadelphia. And he wasn't a very good editor. He fell behind a lot. You never knew when the copy of the Pennsylvania Gazette was going to come out because he would forget deadlines and he would skimp and he would be like, oh yeah, that's right, I'm supposed to be publishing a paper. And then he'd forget to distribute it. He wasn't a very good editor, but he wrote for his own paper. And because he wrote for his own paper, people liked to read it because he was a good writer. He was funny. Let me read you an excerpt from one of the Simons Do-Goods. Y'all want to hear something that he wrote? He's talking about hoop skirts. These monstrous topsy-turvy mortar pieces are neither fit for the church, the hall, or the kitchen, and if a number of them were well mounted on an island, they would look more like engines of war for bombarding the town than ornaments of the fairer sex. That was the kind of stuff that he wrote to entertain people. So he published a lot of his own work in the Pennsylvania Gazette, and as a result, people subscribed, and with their subscriptions came more money so that he could do that more. Well, among them, Poor Richard's Almanac. One of the publications that he came out with was an almanac. And an almanac, how many of y'all ever read the Farmer's Almanac? Yeah, occasionally. Okay. For some reason, my husband gets me one every year. I'm like not a farmer, so I don't really know why he does that. I don't know. But he's like, it came out again. And I'm like, good for it, Yay, yes. Thanks, sweetie. So I always end up with a copy of the Farmer's Almanac, and it tells me everything I need to know about how to plant things I'm never going to plant. I don't know. It's an extremely useful document. Poor Richard's Almanac had that kind of stuff in it. It had recipes, and it had planting times and growing times and stuff like that. That's not why people read it. They read it for the articles. Like, they read it for the advice that it gave because they were so comical. And one of the things that you often found in Poor Richard's Almanac was one-liner pieces of advice. Little proverbs that you could carry around with you. 3 can keep a secret if 2 of them are dead. Lost time is never found. Fish and visitors stink after 3 days. My grandfather was a big fan of that one. My mother would always try to get him to come and stay for like a couple of weeks over the summer or something, and he would always say, oh no, fish and visitors stink after 3 days. Love your enemies, for they're the ones that will tell you your faults. And there cannot be good living where there is not good drinking. I should point out to you that the Dry Club was not necessarily a place where there was no alcohol. It was a place where drinking was not what they primarily did. It was where talking was more important than drinking, but they still had things to drink. So he believed in that. The Almanac was started publishing it in 1733. By 1739, the combination of the Almanac and the Pennsylvania Gazette had made Ben Franklin one of the richest men in the colonies. People buying his printed goods made him ridiculously rich and very, very popular. So in 1733, he started publishing the Farmer's Almanac. In 1734, he joined the Freemasons. Okay, the Freemasons were a moralistic society attached to the Anglican Church. They were working men to begin with, who had trades and who had crafts and skills, but they were people who wanted to come together to elevate themselves into a more holy way of living. That was how it started. Yeah, and I think in a lot of ways that's kind of where it keeps getting back to. Every once in a while the Masons do something historically weird, and then, like for instance, there are Masons in England at this time, but there are also Masons in Scotland, and the Masons in Scotland end up down in like Mexico, in the Mexican Spanish, New Spain, and they end up fighting with each other. Different lodges end up fighting with each other, and like whole movements are based on which Scottish Rite Masonic lodge you belong to in Mexico. So like every once in a while they do weird things. But overall, originally their intention was to lift the standard of moralistic behavior of their members. You couldn't just be a tradesman. You had to be a tradesman who wanted to be the, best moral example to your community as you could. That was how they started. The first Freemason society in the American colonies was in Philadelphia. So it was the first Masonic lodge in the Americas was in Philadelphia, and it had only been established for a couple of years when Ben Franklin joined it. He became a Grand Master after 1 year. He also published the first document, the first Masonic book, and sent it back to England. So he was the first one to actually write Masonic stuff down and publish it in a book. He founded, with his wealth and his position in society, he founded the first charity school in Philadelphia for kids like him, for kids that had been in the same position he was, kids who wanted to be educated, whose parents thought they should be educated, but who couldn't afford it. So he founded the Academy of Philadelphia. He also helped to raise a militia in Philadelphia. He began to see the need for tying all of these different little populations together, the Germans and the Scottish and all these people together into a joint cause. So he began to form a militia and ask people from each of these communities to send people to be part of this militia, so that if there should be a threat to Philadelphia or to any of the surrounding colonies, they would be able to rouse that militia to face that threat. And that would be people from all walks of life. It's a great idea. It doesn't really become really critically important in the 1730s. When it becomes really critically important is in the French and Indian War, which has not happened yet, which you'll read about on Friday. Yes? He started the first public school in Philadelphia. But no, what you're thinking of, the public school, the idea of everybody chipping in and then there just being a school that all the kids can go to, that's really got another 50 years before we start having those in America. And that's the Little Red Schoolhouse, which is, it's coming, but it's not there yet. But the idea of having a big city, that there should be an academy that people can send their kids to without paying out the nose to go there. He got involved in politics. All these connections in all these different communities gave him the ability to get involved in politics. He became a councilman and then climbed until he was the president of Pennsylvania, which is the equivalent of the governor of Pennsylvania. But they didn't call it that. They called it the president of Pennsylvania. So he became the governor of Pennsylvania. And because of all of his work in educational circles, he was awarded honorary degrees from all these colleges he never attended. He got a Master's of Arts from Harvard, Yale, and William and Mary College, and he got an honorary PhD from Oxford. So even though he himself never got to go to any of these schools, he became, on paper, one of the most highly educated people in the colonies. I'm not sure exactly why it's important that he have all of these honorary degrees. I think it was because if you award somebody an honorary degree, then when they talk about you in their newspaper, which lots and lots of people read, then maybe they'll say something good about you. So I think it was for the publicity for these universities. So his love life, he did have a relationship with a woman, nobody knows who it was. And through that relationship with that mystery woman, he had a son, and he kept that son, even though he declared him, this is definitely my illegitimate son. He still kept, and took care of that son, and that was his son, William. But as far as love goes, he actually went back and married Deborah Reed. You remember the 15-year-old that he proposed to, whose husband ran off to Barbados? Well, he couldn't marry her because she was legally still married to the guy in Barbados, and she couldn't divorce that guy because of the way that their marriage had been originally set up. So he did something incredibly scandalous. He moved her into the house with him and had children with her, even though she was married to somebody else. So through this process, Ben Franklin, who's one of the most visible people in the colonies, also does this really scandalous thing, moves this woman in and has a couple of kids with her and lives as though she's his wife, even though everybody knows that she's not. So, you know, they have 2 children, but one of them dies at the age of 4 from smallpox. So I just want to take a second to talk a little bit about medical care in the colonies. Because it is possible for even the richest man in the colonies to have a son die of smallpox. It's important that we understand that medicine in the colonies is not going well. A lot of the medical advancements that come through, like, you know, the Renaissance and stuff like that, they kind of keep making those advancements in England, but they don't manage to cross them over into the colonies. So medical treatment in the colony is not very good. The physicians are basically kind of a joke. You don't become a physician because you have ambition. You become a physician because you're not good at anything else. So it's sort of the thing you end up in if you're not a very good lawyer. You know, if you can't make money as a lawyer, you might become a physician. They're poorly trained. They're all basically doing guesswork. And they, hold on one second. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay, so one of the favorite ways of treating illnesses is bleeding. If you're sick and you have a fever, the best thing to do is to let all the feverish blood out of you so that you can replace it with non-feverish blood. Yeah, that sticks around for a while. This idea that you can bleed an illness, an infection out is based on a very flawed idea about how the human body works. Sometimes they don't have doctors, so instead barbers do it. You know, because it's the same thing, right? As the person who cuts your hair should be responsible for treating your illnesses. Powdered dried toad is one of the treatments that comes out of this time. I don't even know how you get a powdered dried toad. I'm not sure what you have to do, but treating smallpox with powdered dried toad is a real thing. So you can imagine that when a disease like smallpox does actually move into a major city like this, that the treatments for it are not very good. So there's an outbreak right around this time in about the 1730s of smallpox. Now in 1721, somebody actually introduced a vaccine. It's a crude vaccine. They basically take a pox from somebody who's sick and then give it to somebody who's healthy in the hopes that their body will be able to fight it when they're healthy. Because one of the things that happens with smallpox is you start off by getting weak and you start off by losing energy, and then the other symptoms start to kick in. So if you could jump right to the pox part while you're still nice and strong and healthy, maybe you could fight it. Maybe you could come through it. That was the idea of that vaccine. It was a live vaccine. Most of our vaccines today are not live vaccines. Very few of them are, in fact. And at some point shortly after this, somebody figures out that there's a correlation between cowpox and smallpox, that if you catch cowpox, you're immune to smallpox, and cowpox is not nearly as difficult to get rid of. So they begin infecting people with cowpox to get rid of smallpox. I don't know if y'all are familiar with how that happened. Dairy maids never caught smallpox, and so they were accused of witchcraft. But actually what it was is they caught cowpox, which was a weaker version of smallpox, and then they were immune to smallpox when it came through. Somebody figures this out at some point and begins infecting people with cowpox so they'll be immune to smallpox. But it doesn't matter. Because it is such a crude vaccination, because it involves infecting yourself on purpose when you're healthy and then just hoping that you survive, Deborah doesn't trust it, so she refuses to give it to her kids. So her son dies of smallpox when he's 4 years old. Okay. There we go. Okay, so let's talk about the rest of Ben Franklin's career. So he was, his primary career was what? What was his primary career? Yeah, but writing, but arguably what was it that made the most money? Huh? No, that wasn't his primary career. He was a printer. Ben Franklin was a printer. That's His primary career was he was a printer, huh?
I said printers.
What you said was, so you gotta help me out here. Okay, but because he was because he had his book clubs and because he has his writing clubs and all this kind of stuff, he was made aware of all kinds of other advancements. So he was what's called a polymath. Y'all know what a polymath is? A polymath is somebody that dabbles in a lot of different areas of education. It's somebody who tries to learn as much as possible. Somebody who likes to learn about a lot of different things. So he's a polymath, and he studies science, he studies medicine, he studies literature, he studies philosophy, he studies religion. And one of the things that yields is that he begins inventing things. So as an inventor, he liked to do experiments following the scientific method. He loved the scientific method, which wasn't really that old. The scientific method was at the beginning of the 1700s, so it hasn't been around that long. But as a result, he begins inventing things that are to solve problems, basically. This is the Franklin stove, which was a small stove that you could fit even in a small place. And it solved the problem of people who didn't have the room for the great big, kitchens with the, I don't know if you can picture, you'll watch a lot of anime, they have them in there where it's like a great big baker's oven. It's like a whole half of your house. A lot of people don't have room for that, but they still need to be able to cook. So he invented a very self-contained little stove. And that was for people in the smaller houses that they had in the cities. He invented the first lightning rod, which actually looked like this. And it grows from there into something much more impressive. And he invented bifocals, which I'm glad of because I got my very first pair of bifocals a week after I started teaching all this class this semester. Because I'm getting old. But I lasted 5 years longer than a lot of people. Most people who get bifocals get them at 40. I didn't get them until I was 45. So, woot, I guess. But I'm really glad he invented them because I can read, which is cool. But of course, his bifocals were two different kinds of glass blended together with a straight line. And you look up through the top and you see far away, and you look down through the bottom and you see up close. It was brilliant, and it was needful because he had trouble seeing. So if you Google it, you can find all kinds of other things that he invented. Who's on the internet right now? No, y'all are just sitting there with your computers open, looking all impressive. Okay. He invented several things, is my point. But probably the biggest thing that he did that made him famous for who he was, even though he was a printer and he was responsible for connecting the colonies through print, and he was an inventor and we still use some of his inventions, the biggest thing he did was serve as a diplomat. Because Franklin loved to travel, he was always going back and forth between England and France and America, and making friends everywhere he went. I don't know why the guy was so popular.
Really popular French ladies.
Right, when I look at him, I'm like, sure, okay. But for some reason, everywhere he went, the ladies couldn't get enough of him. And because they couldn't get enough of him, he got invitations to their husbands' houses too. So because he was such a popular ladies' man, genuinely can't tell you why, he began to make connections all over the French royalty and the English royalty and the Spanish royalty, everywhere that he went, which is going to be really useful when? When is it going to be a great thing that Franklin is such a good diplomat? Yeah, when America suddenly needs help because it's fighting for its independence, it's going to be a great thing that we have this person who's so well connected to all of the French courts. Say again? Yeah, it's really good to be on friendly terms with the French. Yeah, there's a good chance that part's actually true. Like I said, I don't know what it was about Franklin that they really loved. There was something about the frontier. You know, you've heard his whole life story. At what point did he live on the frontier? Never. He never lived on the frontier. He went from Boston to Philadelphia. He lived in a city and then he moved to another city. But for some reason, when he went over to France, he wore like a fur hat and a fur coat because he was a frontier man. And that impressed everybody so much. He was from the wild Americas, which since they'd never seen it, they didn't know that that wasn't true. They didn't know that he was just from another city that wasn't that different from the cities that they were in. Just younger. It was just, you know, newer. But other than that, they were port cities full of like, you know, European people. But he wore these French hats, these fur-covered hats, and wore them into the French court, and then people got really excited about this frontierman who is so well educated, but also so rough and capable and probably wrestles bears and all this kind of stuff. I'm not really sure. I just know that he sold the idea of the American as something really impressive. Americans are people of ingenuity. Americans are people of education, and Americans face down bears on the frontier. And they also like you, French person. They like you, Spanish court member. So it's good to have a relationship with Americans. So now that we've been all the way through, and we'll talk more about Ben Franklin as we get into the revolution, because now he's just positioned. The part I'm going to leave you at, he's really just positioned for what happens next. He's the governor of Pennsylvania. He runs all of the communication because he runs all the printing presses, and he networks other printing presses together. So he begins to set up committees of communication, committees of correspondence. He's positioned for what happens next. And what happens next is going to lead eventually to revolution. So now that we've been all the way through his life, what is it about him that makes him the first American? What are some of the defining characteristics of his life?
He builds himself up out of nothing.
He builds himself. Okay.
He invented all those things.
Okay. He's inventive.
He's a printer or
Right. Okay. So as a printer, he communicates. Okay. What else?
his relationships with other, I guess he was friends with the English or with the
Yeah. He is
Something like that.
international. Okay. What else? Smart, educated, but also just smart, which are two different things, by the way, says the woman up here who gets paid for your education. Sorry. Anyway. Okay. Okay. Socially mixed. Okay. And how is that different from Europe? Do the classes mingle a lot in those European societies right now? Right, okay. So not classist. Okay,
He doesn't sound like he's kind of open to whatever is new.
right, open-minded.
Learn about it and stuff.
Okay, now thinking about what you can imagine, because we haven't really studied that deeply, but what you can imagine about European society, and these are the same people that are like, having inquisitions and stuff. Can you see how this would be a different kind of person than the people that are moving around Europe at the time? How these would be defining characteristics of what makes an American. So what do you think? Do we still define America this way? Ideally.
Yeah,
In our best moments, do we still think of these as American things? What do y'all think? Zoom, y'all want to weigh in?
I'm sorry, I was talking to somebody. What would you want to talk about?
Oh, okay. These defining characteristics of Ben Franklin, the fact that he was inventive, self-built, he communicated, he was international, he wasn't classist. Are those still traits that we identify as American today?
We like to pretend that
Yeah, it's probably not as much, just with kind of the stagnation of things recently, but I guess the general idea is still there.
Right. The ideal American is still all of these things. Would it surprise you to find out that these are not things that would necessarily be prized in every environment, in every being built up by yourself, starting with nothing and ending up with everything? That in some societies that wouldn't just be unheard of, but it would be frowned upon. How dare you upset society this way? Why aren't you just happy with the position you've been given? You were born into a role, you need to keep that role. So would it surprise you to find out that this is in some societies, a lot of these things are definitely not marks of a good person? So,
Yeah, it would not.
Yeah, no, it's not surprising. But as the penultimate American, the first American, these are the traits that he has. So that's kind of why we refer to him as the first American. He goes overseas and he is the voice of America for a lot of those French court, Spanish court, the English court. He is the voice of what America is going through and what America wants when he begins to write back and forth to the crown. So he is the American. Okay, y'all understand?
Yes.
Okay, I've given you a document to read that he wrote. And it's going to relate a lot to what we're going to talk about on, let me get into it over here. On Wednesday, we're going to talk about a movement that's going to happen in the colonies called the Great Awakening. And I'd like you to take a look at this document before we come back on Wednesday. You will have assignment for it after that, but take a look at it. It's Benjamin Franklin on the Great Awakening, and it's from his autobiography, which was an incredibly popular book after he wrote it himself. It was bought, and it bought him a lot of money, and it's still one of the most popular books of early American history. But this is an excerpt from it where he talks specifically about the Great Awakening. So I'd like you to take a look at that before class on Wednesday. Does anybody have any questions?